I was standing alone in a quiet chapel when the lawyer leaned toward me and said in a low, careful voice, "You are the sole beneficiary." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Sole beneficiary of what the man in the casket had no family, no friends, no mourners. And yet the lawyer was looking at me as if this moment had been planned for years. I felt the blood drain from my face the way it does right before something irreversible happens. Outside, the winter wind rattled the bare branches, and inside, every ugly rumor I'd ever heard about the strange millionaire next door came rushing back at once. That was how it ended, but it didn't begin there. I grew up on a quiet street in a Midwestern town where nothing much ever changed. The houses were modest, but well kept with neat lawns and American flags that went up every Memorial Day and came down after Labor Day. People waved when they drove by. They knew your name, your parents' names, and sometimes even your grandparents'. It was the kind of place where neighbors noticed if your trash cans stayed out too long. Everyone noticed his house. It sat right next to ours, larger than the rest, older with tall hedges and dark windows. For as long as I could remember, that house belonged to the strange millionaire next door. No one ever used his name. He was always just him. People whispered that he had made a fortune years ago, though no one could quite explain how. He drove an old sedan instead of a luxury car, wore plain clothes, and never joined neighborhood barbecues or holiday block parties. That alone was enough to make people uneasy. My parents hated him. That's not an exaggeration. They didn't just dislike him. They distrusted him with a passion that bordered on obsession. From the time I was old enough to understand warnings, my mother told me never to speak to him. My father went further. "That man is dangerous," he'd say, his voice tight with certainty. "Stay away from his property. Don't look at him. Don't wave." As a child, I believed them. Children believe what they're taught, especially when fear is involved. When other kids dared each other to ring his doorbell on Halloween, I stayed back on the sidewalk, my heart pounding. When neighbors whispered about strange noises or suspicious behavior, I nodded along even though I'd never seen anything myself. What I did see were small things that didn't quite match the stories. His lawn was always trimmed, his hedges perfectly shaped. In winter, I'd wake up to find the sidewalk cleared of snow before anyone else was up. Sometimes late at night I saw a light flicker on in his garage, and the next morning a neighbor's car would be running again after days of sitting dead in the driveway. No one ever thanked him. Most people pretended not to notice. My parents noticed everything, but only the things that confirmed what they already believed. When a for sale sign stayed up too long down the street, my father muttered that it was because people didn't want to live near that man. When a dog barked endlessly one night, my mother whispered that it was probably because he scared it. I grew up left home and built a life that valued discipline and quiet responsibility. I learned to keep my emotions in check, to observe before reacting, to treat people with respect, whether they deserved it or not. When I came back to visit my parents over the years, the street looked the same. The flags still went up. The gossip still traveled faster than truth. And the strange millionaire next door was still there alone. One evening not long after I turned 30, my car stalled right in front of his house. It was late, cold, and embarrassing. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, debating whether to call my parents or a tow truck. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He didn't rush toward me or loom in the shadows the way people said he would. He walked slowly, keeping his distance, and asked if I needed help. His voice was calm, almost gentle. I nodded, and he helped me restart the engine without a single inappropriate word or gesture. When I thanked him, he gave a small nod and went back inside. That was it. No lecture, no lingering, no danger. I didn't tell my parents about that night. I knew they wouldn't want to hear it. A few months later, an ambulance came. Red and blue lights reflected off the windows of his dark house. By morning, the rumor mill was already running. He had died alone. No family had come forward. The relief in some people's voices was hard to miss. There was a funeral notice in the paper. Small, easy to overlook. My parents laughed when I mentioned it. "Why would you go?" my mother asked. "No one else is." But something in me wouldn't let it go. So I went. And that's how I found myself sitting alone in a chapel meant for dozens, staring at a closed casket, when a lawyer walked up and changed everything I thought I knew. After the funeral, I didn't go straight home. I sat in my car for a long time with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching my breath fog the windshield. The chapel had emptied quickly. No procession of grieving relatives, no murmured condolences exchanged in the parking lot. Just a few polite nods from the funeral director and the lawyer's card placed carefully in my hand, as if it were something fragile. I drove back to my parents' house, the long way past the familiar streets I'd known since childhood. Everything looked the same. Neat lawns, closed curtains, the kind of quiet that feels comforting when you belong, and suffocating when you don't. At dinner that night, my parents barely asked about my day. When I mentioned I'd gone to the funeral, my father snorted. "Waste of time," he said, pushing peas around his plate. "That man didn't deserve anyone showing up." My mother nodded in agreement. "People like him choose to be alone. There's always a reason." I said nothing. I had learned long ago that silence could be safer than arguing. Still, as I washed the dishes later, their words echoed in my mind. Choose to be alone. Was that really true? Or had the neighborhood chosen for him? Growing up, distance had been the rule. Not just physical distance, the tall hedges, the unspoken property lines, but emotional distance too. People crossed the street rather than walk past his driveway. They lowered their voices when his lights were on. Fear, I realized, had become a habit, and habits once formed are hard to break. I remembered moments I'd tucked away over the years, moments that never seemed important enough to bring up, like the summer when a storm knocked out power across the block. Candles flickered in windows. Phones rang with worried calls. By morning, the power was still out, but a quiet hum came from his house. A generator. By evening, extension cords ran discreetly to two elderly neighbors' refrigerators. No announcement, no credit taken. The cords were gone by sunrise. Or the time Mrs. Calhoun slipped on ice and broke her wrist. She told everyone the ambulance arrived just in time, but she never mentioned who had called it. I had seen him standing at the end of his driveway that night, phone in hand, coat pulled tight against the cold. When I thought back on it, there were dozens of small kindnesses like that. None of them fit the story people told about him. None of them fit the label dangerous. After the funeral, I found myself walking past his house more often. The blinds were drawn now, the lights off. A quiet finality hung in the air. I wondered what it must have been like to live there for decades, surrounded by people who saw you every day and still never really saw you at all. A week later, the lawyer called. His name was Mr. Harlan, and his voice carried the calm assurance of someone used to delivering unexpected news. He asked if I could come by his office to review some documents. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. My stomach tightened the moment I hung up. The office was downtown above a bakery that smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. Inside, everything was orderly dark wood furniture, framed certificates, soft lighting. Mr. Harlan greeted me with a firm handshake and an expression that suggested he'd been waiting for this meeting a long time. He didn't rush. He asked about my drive, offered water, let the silence settle before speaking. Then he said Mr. Whitaker was very deliberate. That was the first time I heard the old man's name. Mr. Whitaker, he explained, had been his client for many years. Meticulous, prepared. He had revised his will several times, each version more detailed than the last. He had anticipated questions, objections, even anger. "You were not a last-minute decision," Mr. Harlan said gently. "He chose you years ago." I must have looked stunned because he slid a folder toward me without opening it. "You don't have to read this today," he added. "But I want you to understand something first." He told me that Mr. Whitaker had no surviving family, that he had deliberately declined invitations, partnerships, and social obligations over the years, not out of arrogance but out of exhaustion. He believed, Mr. Harlan said, that once people decide who you are, there's very little you can do to change their minds. As I drove home, that sentence stayed with me. That night, I lay awake, listening to the house settle to my parents' muffled voices down the hall. I thought about all the times I'd followed the rules without questioning them, all the times I'd chosen distance because it was easier than curiosity. In the days that followed, word began to spread that the old man had left something behind. No details yet, just whispers. I caught snippets at the grocery store, at the post office, in the waiting room, at the dentist. People who had once avoided his name now spoke it with sudden interest. It made me uneasy. I started walking the neighborhood in the evenings, something I hadn't done in years. Passing his house, I noticed the little details others never mentioned: the carefully repaired fence, the bird feeder hung just out of reach of squirrels, the wind chimes tucked behind the porch where only he could hear them. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't before: regret. Not for anything dramatic, not for a friendship that never happened, but for the simple fact that it had taken a funeral for me to really see the man who lived next door. And somewhere deep down I sensed that whatever waited inside that lawyer's folder was going to force more people than just me to see him too. By the time the official notice appeared in the local paper, most people already knew. In a town like ours, news didn't travel by headlines. It traveled by glances, by lowered voices in grocery aisles, by the way people leaned a little closer to hear what they weren't supposed to. Mr. Whitaker passed away quietly at home. That was all the notice said. No mention of family, no mention of services beyond a simple funeral at a small chapel on the edge of town. I clipped the notice out of the paper and folded it into my purse, not entirely sure why. Maybe I needed proof that he had existed at all, that he hadn't just been a story the neighborhood told itself for decades. My parents reacted exactly the way I expected. My father shook his head and said, "Good. That house will finally be worth something now." My mother added, "Let's hope whoever buys it tears it down." Their words landed harder than they meant to. Not because I was suddenly defending Mr. Whitaker, but because I realized how easily cruelty had become casual. Nobody spoke about him with anger anymore, just dismissal, as if the worst thing a person could be was inconvenient to remember. The morning of the funeral, the sky was low and gray. A damp cold settled into my bones as I drove across town. I told myself I was only going out of respect, that I'd sit quietly in the back and leave without drawing attention. I didn't expect anyone else to be there, but a small part of me hoped I was wrong. I wasn't. The chapel doors creaked softly when I opened them. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old wood and lilies. Rows of empty chairs stretched out in front of me. At the front, a simple casket rested beneath a single arrangement of white flowers. No photographs, no slideshow, no cluster of grieving relatives whispering into tissues. Just silence. I chose a seat near the middle, my footsteps echoing louder than I liked. The minister gave me a polite nod, his expression neutral, practiced. He didn't seem surprised by my presence or by the absence of anyone else. As the service began, I found myself listening more closely than I ever had at a funeral. Every word carried weight when there were no distractions. The minister spoke about a life lived quietly, about dignity, about the mystery of what people carry inside them. He avoided specifics. I suspected he didn't know many. I looked at the casket and tried to imagine the man inside it, the careful way he trimmed his hedges, the steady hands that fixed engines in the dark, the way he kept his distance, not out of contempt but perhaps out of self-preservation. When the service ended, there was no line to pass the family, no crowd to filter through. I stood alone for a moment, unsure of what to do next. That was when a man in a dark suit approached me from the side aisle. "Ms. Carter," he asked gently. I nodded, startled that he knew my name. "My name is William Harlan," he said. "I was Mr. Whitaker's attorney." He extended his hand. His grip was firm but respectful, his eyes steady. This was a man used to being careful with words. "I want to thank you for coming," he continued. It would have meant a great deal to him. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded again. "If you have a moment," he added, "I'd like to speak with you." We stepped into a small side room off the chapel, quiet and warm compared to the drafty main hall. He gestured for me to sit, then remained standing as if unsure how much time I wanted to give him. "There are some matters Mr. Whitaker asked me to attend to after his passing," he said. "Matters that involve you." That was when my chest tightened. He explained that Mr. Whitaker had left detailed instructions, that he had planned everything carefully, that he had anticipated questions, objections, even disbelief. Mr. Harlan spoke slowly, giving me space to absorb each sentence. "I know this may come as a shock," he said at last, "but Mr. Whitaker named you in his will." I stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence. A small bequest, a token gesture, a mistake. "You are," he continued, choosing his words with precision, "the sole beneficiary." The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the chair to steady myself. Sole beneficiary. The phrase echoed in my head, absurd and heavy all at once. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said finally. "I barely knew him." Mr. Harlan gave a small knowing smile. He would have said the opposite. He didn't explain further then. He simply handed me his card and told me to call when I was ready. "There's no rush," he said, "but there is quite a bit to discuss." When I stepped back outside, the air felt sharper, more real. The chapel stood quiet behind me as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, my thoughts racing. By the time I got home, my parents were already waiting. "Who was that man talking to you?" my mother asked the moment I walked in. "We heard from Mrs. Collins that a lawyer was there." I hesitated. I hadn't planned to tell them yet, but secrets have a way of announcing themselves. "He said Mr. Whitaker left me something," I replied carefully. My father laughed. "Left you what, his junk?" I didn't answer, not yet. That night as I lay awake, the weight of the day settled over me. The emptiness of the chapel, the lawyer's calm voice, the words "sole beneficiary" circling my thoughts. Mr. Whitaker had died alone, that much was true. But somehow even in death he had found a way to be heard. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the empty chapel again, the long rows of chairs, the single casket, the lawyer's calm face as he said words that didn't belong to me. Sole beneficiary. The phrase felt borrowed, like a coat that didn't quite fit yet. By morning, the house was quiet. My parents had gone out early, probably to spread their version of events before anyone asked me directly. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring at Mr. Harlan's card. It was thick, cream-colored, the kind of card meant to last. I turned it over twice before finally dialing the number. His office was just as calm as I remembered. When I arrived later that afternoon, he greeted me with the same steady politeness and invited me to sit. This time the folder was already open on the desk between us. "I want to be very clear," he said, leaning back slightly. "What you're about to hear may feel overwhelming. You're allowed to take your time." He began with the basics. Mr. Whitaker had been wealthy far beyond what anyone in town suspected. Not flashy wealth, patient wealth. Investments made over decades. Companies no one talked about. Decisions made carefully and quietly. He lived simply by choice, not necessity. Then came the part that made my throat tighten. "He left everything to you," Mr. Harlan said. "The house, his accounts, the trust he established years ago. And..." He paused, then slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "This letter." I didn't open it yet. I couldn't. Just seeing my name written on the front in neat, careful handwriting made my hands tremble. "Why me?" I asked. It was the only question that mattered. Mr. Harlan folded his hands. "He told me you were the only person on that street who ever looked at him without fear. Not curiosity, not suspicion, just decency." I thought of the night my car had broken down, of the way he'd kept his distance, spoken softly, and gone back inside without expecting anything in return. He noticed things, Mr. Harlan continued. Who crossed the street, who avoided eye contact, who repeated rumors they didn't understand, and who didn't. I finally opened the letter after I got home. I sat in my car in the driveway, afraid that if I went inside, my parents would sense the weight of it before I was ready. The letter was long, written in a steady hand. Mr. Whitaker didn't waste words. He explained that he had spent most of his life being misunderstood, and that eventually he had stopped trying to correct people. Not because he was guilty of what they said, but because defending yourself to those who don't want the truth is exhausting. He wrote about watching the neighborhood from his window, about noticing small kindnesses and quiet cruelties, about how fear once planted grows faster than facts. "You never asked me who I was," he wrote. "You never needed to. You treated me like a neighbor, not a threat. That was more than most people gave me in a lifetime." I sat there long after I finished reading the envelope resting on my lap, the car growing cold around me. It didn't take long for the town to find out. By the end of the week, people who had avoided my parents for years were suddenly stopping by. Some brought casseroles, others brought questions disguised as concern. A few were blunt. "I heard he left you something," Mrs. Collins said one afternoon, peering past me into the house as if she expected to see stacks of cash. "Must have been lonely, that old man." My parents' reaction was louder and far less polite. "This is ridiculous," my father said when I finally told them the truth. "He manipulated you. People like him always do." My mother added, "You can't keep that money. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the community." I didn't argue, not yet. I had learned that timing matters, that sometimes the strongest response is patience. That evening I walked next door for the first time without hesitation. The house felt different now, not empty, just quiet like it was waiting. I stood on the porch for a long moment before unlocking the door with the key Mr. Harlan had given me. Inside, everything was orderly. No hoarding, no chaos, just a life lived deliberately and alone. On a small table by the window sat a single photograph. I picked it up carefully. It was of the street taken years ago, children riding bikes, flags waving, and at the edge of the frame a younger version of me walking past his house head high, not looking afraid. For the first time I understood. Mr. Whitaker hadn't left me his wealth as a reward. He'd left it as a responsibility. And whether my parents or the town liked it or not, that responsibility was now mine to carry. The next morning I woke up to the sound of voices outside. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I recognized the familiar rise and fall of conversation, the kind that carried just far enough to be overheard. When I looked out the front window, I saw 3 neighbors standing near the edge of our driveway, pretending to admire the weather, while clearly waiting for someone to step outside. Word had traveled faster than I expected. By mid-morning, my phone began ringing. Old numbers I hadn't seen in years appeared on the screen. People I barely remembered suddenly wanted to check in. They all started the same way, polite, cautious, warm, but each conversation drifted toward the same unspoken question. "What did he leave you?" I answered carefully. I told them I was still sorting through paperwork, that there were legal matters to handle, that I didn't have details yet. None of that was a lie, but none of it satisfied them either. My parents were worse. They paced the house like trapped animals, their anger feeding on itself. My father slammed cabinet doors and muttered about injustice. My mother cried not out of sadness, but out of humiliation. To them, this wasn't just about money. It was about reputation, about being wrong in front of people they had spent decades trying to impress. "He made fools of us," my father said that night, pointing toward the window that faced Mr. Whitaker's house. "That man planned this." "No," I said quietly. "He told the truth." "That only made him angrier." The lawyer called again a few days later to let me know that the will had been officially filed. Once it was public record, there was no containing the fallout. By afternoon, a reporter from the regional paper had left a voicemail asking for comment. I didn't call back. Instead, I went next door. I had started spending time in Mr. Whitaker's house each morning, not to claim it, but to understand it. There were no secret rooms, no stacks of cash hidden behind walls. Just files, neatly labeled boxes of documents, old letters and records. He had kept everything. Not as ammunition, but as memory. That was where I found the truth the neighborhood had never wanted to hear. Years earlier, long before I was born, Mr. Whitaker had been accused of financial misconduct at the company where he worked. The accusation had spread quickly, fed by jealousy and poor reporting. He was investigated, cleared, and formally exonerated, but the damage was already done. His name had been dragged through headlines and whispered conversations. Promotions vanished. Invitations stopped coming. He had won legally. He had lost socially. One letter stood out among the rest. It was from the company's board, written years after the accusation, offering a public apology. Mr. Whitaker had declined it. In the margin, in his careful handwriting, he'd written, "Apologies don't rebuild trust. Time reveals truth on its own." I sat on the floor surrounded by his papers, understanding for the first time how thoroughly a lie can outlive the truth. When I finally spoke to the lawyer again, I asked him something I hadn't asked before. Did he expect this, I asked, the anger, the backlash. Mr. Harlan didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "He told me people would be upset, that they would feel entitled to what they never earned." And he was okay with that. He believed discomfort was part of learning, the lawyer replied. The backlash arrived in waves. First came the guilt. Neighbors stopping by with stories of how they'd always felt sorry for him. Then came the demands. Suggestions that I donate the money, that I hand over the house, that I do the right thing. Finally came the accusations. He bought her loyalty, someone said loudly at the grocery store. Probably planned it years ago. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth was written in black ink, dated and documented long before anyone thought to care. The breaking point came when my parents confronted me in the living room, voices raised, faces flushed with anger and fear. "You need to give it back," my mother said, "or give it away. You can't keep this." "Why?" I asked calmly. "Because it makes us look bad," my father snapped. There it was, the honest reason. I took a breath and told them about the letters, about the investigation, about the apology he never accepted. I told them how fear had replaced facts, and how silence had done the rest. They didn't interrupt. When I finished, my mother sat down heavily, her anger finally giving way to something quieter. Regret, maybe, or shame. That night, for the first time since the will was read, the house felt truly silent. The truth had finally been spoken aloud. And once spoken, it could no longer be ignored. The silence in our house the night after my parents heard the truth felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from anger. It was the kind that follows realization, the moment when familiar beliefs collapse and there's nothing ready to replace them. The next morning, my mother moved through the kitchen slowly, as if the room itself had changed shape overnight. My father sat at the table, staring into his coffee untouched. Neither of them mentioned Mr. Whitaker. Neither of them mentioned the will. But the tension was there, thick and unspoken. It didn't last. By the end of the week, the pressure returned, this time from the outside. Letters began arriving, some polite, some accusatory, a few anonymous. People who had never once crossed the old man's driveway now felt entitled to explain what should happen to what he'd left behind. One letter suggested I donate everything to the town in the spirit of healing. Another warned me that keeping the inheritance would divide the community. One went so far as to say Mr. Whitaker had been unstable and that his will should be contested. I read each letter carefully, then placed them in a folder I labeled simply noise. The real confrontation came on a Sunday afternoon. My parents asked me to sit down with them in the living room, the same room where they'd once warned me not to wave at the man next door, the same room where fear had been passed down like a family tradition. "You're putting us in an impossible position," my father said, his voice tight but quieter than before. "People are talking." "They always were," I replied evenly. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We didn't know," she said. "We truly didn't know." "I know," I answered, and for the first time I meant it without resentment. I told them what I had decided. I wasn't going to give the inheritance away out of guilt. I wasn't going to hide it out of shame, and I wasn't going to use it to prove a point. Instead, I would honor the man who had trusted me not with spectacle but with purpose. I explained my plan carefully. Part of the estate would remain untouched, managed responsibly, just as Mr. Whitaker had done his entire life. Another part would be used to establish a small scholarship fund, quiet, local, aimed at students who showed consistency, discipline, and integrity, rather than popularity or charm. I would restore the house, not erase it. Keep it as a place of dignity, not gossip. A reminder that lives don't need approval to have value. And finally, I would create a community fund not in my name, and not even fully in his, but dedicated to repairing harm done by rumors and fear. Counseling services, educational workshops, conversations that taught people how easily they could be wrong. My father listened without interrupting. When I finished, he exhaled slowly and rubbed his hands together. "You're better at this than we were," he admitted quietly. It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough to matter. Change didn't happen all at once. It never does. Some neighbors remained distant. Others softened gradually. A few surprised me entirely, offering help, asking questions, admitting they'd been wrong. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't need them. One evening I invited my parents to walk with me next door. They hesitated, then followed. We stood on the porch of Mr. Whitaker's house together, the same porch they'd warned me about for decades. The wind chimes stirred gently in the evening air. My mother touched the railing as if seeing it for the first time. "He kept this nicer than I ever realized," she murmured. "Yes," I said, "he did." Inside, I showed them the photograph he'd taken years earlier, the street, the flags, the children riding bikes. My younger self caught at the edge of the frame. My father stared at it for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. "We were wrong," he said. Those 3 words carried more weight than any apology could have. As the weeks passed, the town settled. Gossip lost its fuel. People grew tired of outrage. Life resumed its rhythm: trash days, church services, quiet evenings. But something subtle had shifted. People paused before repeating stories. They asked questions. They hesitated before judging. Responsibility, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's carried quietly day after day in the choices you make when no one is watching. Mr. Whitaker had lived that way his entire life. Now it was my turn. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if the town itself needed time to decide what it wanted to become next. The trees along our street budded later than usual, and when the flowers finally appeared, they did so quietly without the celebration people often expect. I found that fitting. Big changes, I'd learned, rarely announce themselves. I moved into Mr. Whitaker's house in early April, not because I needed the space, but because it felt wrong to leave it empty. The first morning I woke up there, sunlight filtered through the same windows that had once made neighbors uneasy. From the inside, the house felt warm, deliberate, and deeply human. Nothing about it was dangerous. It never had been. I kept most of the rooms as they were: his furniture, his books, even the old chair by the window where he must have spent countless hours watching a street that never truly saw him. I repaired what needed fixing and left the rest alone. Some things I believed deserved to remain exactly as they were. People noticed. At first they slowed their cars when passing the house. Then they waved. A few stopped to talk. Conversations were cautious at first, then sincere. More than one neighbor admitted they'd been wrong, though not all of them said it out loud. That was fine. Understanding doesn't always need confession. The scholarship fund launched quietly, just as I'd planned. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no plaques with my name on them. Applications came in slowly at first, then steadily. I read every one. Stories of perseverance, of students who worked part-time jobs, cared for family members, showed up every day without applause. Those were the people Mr. Whitaker had noticed in his own way. Those were the people I chose to support. My parents changed too, though more slowly. My mother began bringing over old photographs from the neighborhood, pictures of block parties, snowstorms, school plays. She wanted to help create a small archive, a way to preserve the street's history, honestly, not selectively. My father, quieter than ever, took on repairs around the house without being asked. Fixing a loose step, replacing a broken latch. Small acts. His way of making peace. One evening we sat together on the porch as the sun went down. The same porch they'd once warned me to avoid. "I wish we'd known," my mother said softly. I looked out at the street, at the houses lined up like familiar faces. "You know now," I replied. "That matters too." The town began using Mr. Whitaker's name again. Not as a warning, as a person. Stories shifted. Fear lost its grip. Children rode their bikes past the house without being pulled back. The hedges no longer felt like barriers. Just plants. Every now and then I'd find myself sitting in the old chair by the window watching the same view he once had. I understood then why he'd stayed, why he'd kept believing that truth would eventually surface even if it took longer than a lifetime. He hadn't needed revenge, he'd needed patience. And in the end he'd been right. What stayed with me most wasn't the inheritance or the house or even the town's transformation. It was the lesson that settled quietly into my bones. Fear is easy. It requires no effort, no curiosity, no courage. Kindness, on the other hand, asks something of us. It asks us to look again, to listen, to stand alone if we have to. Mr. Whitaker had stood alone for a very long time. I often think about that empty chapel and the way my footsteps echoed as I walked down the aisle. About how close we all came to letting his life disappear without acknowledgement. If I'd stayed home that day, if fear or habit had won his story, might have ended very differently. But it didn't. Because one person showed up. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this: the people everyone avoids are often the ones carrying the heaviest burdens. And sometimes the smallest act, showing up, saying hello, refusing to judge, can change more than you ever imagined. If this story made you pause or reminded you of someone you once misunderstood, I invite you to reflect on that feeling. Share this story with someone who might need it. And if you believe as I do now that quiet decency still matters in this world, consider staying with us, subscribing, listening, and continuing these stories of truth, patience, and humanity. Because the stories we choose to hear and the people we choose not to fear can shape who we become. 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 Who we become.